Hi everyone, I hope you're having a nice evening. I'm going to talk about the ICO's recent enforcement activity and its strategy for 2025. So looking first at the ICO's enforcement. When I started to prepare this talk, I sat down and thought about producing a slide which could capture how certain privacy campaigners feel about the ICO's enforcement activity. And I came up with this. So while we at Bristow's don't agree with this view, and we don't think it's fair to describe the ICO's enforcement activity as invisible, it's important to understand why this opinion exists. It's probably in part due to the fact that the ICO originally threw down the gauntlet for GDPR enforcement in 2019 with its big plans to fine Marriott, and this didn't necessarily work out. And the enforcement activity since then has been a little bit more muted. In the last year, the ICO has issued only a handful of monetary penalty notices for UK GDPR breaches. To some, this is disappointing. However, in terms of where this sits on the grand scale of like the biggest letdowns of all time, it's certainly not as disappointing as this, or this, and it's definitely not as disappointing as this. In fact, I was chatting to our cameraman for the evening, Duncan, earlier, and he actually told me that this film gave rise to toxic fandom. So it's probably more accurate to describe the ICO's enforcement as maybe not quite living up to our very high expectations, but certainly serving its purpose. So possibly maybe a little bit more like this. In terms of the enforcement we have seen, the key trends we have observed are the following. So firstly, there's been a significant amount of enforcement in respect of telemarketing breaches. I think this is something we can all get behind. And if anyone from the ICO is listening, I urge you to pay particular attention to the activities of legal recruiters. Secondly, there's been a renewed focus on online tracking and digital advertising, with the ICO broadening its cookie sweep to cover the 1,000 most visited websites in the UK. Thirdly, there's been a significant amount of enforcement, as always, against public sector bodies. And finally, there have been new investigations opened into video sharing and social media platforms and how they process the personal data of children and teenagers. So I'm just going to spend a little more time on the latter two. In respect of public sector enforcement, the key trend we have observed is that the ICO typically opts for reprimands rather than monetary penalty notices. Obviously, this reflects the futility of diverting public funds away from where they are most needed. But the reluctance to fine the public sector bodies was particularly apparent when, following an incident which impacted NHS systems and compromised a large volume of patient data, the ICO chose instead to impose a fine on the processor responsible, Advanced Computer Software Limited. Now, on the face of it, this should have been very straightforward. Advanced Software Computer Limited failed to implement MFA or carry out vulnerability scanning. It's a clear Article 32 breach, right? But in many of these cases, regulators will still choose to go after the controller rather than the processor. So this decision could have an impact on negotiations between controllers and processors going forward, where controllers often seek broad contractual protections from processors on the basis that they're more likely to be exposed to direct regulatory enforcement. The decision is also notable because it demonstrates the ICO's willingness to negotiate a fine, in particular when there are assurances not to appeal the ICO's decision. This was one of the reasons that the ICO chose to reduce the fine from £6 million to £3 million. Moving on to the focus on children and teens in the context of video sharing and social media. This has been a focus over the last few months, and it's certainly going to carry over into next year. So earlier this year, the ICO announced that it had opened investigations into how TikTok processes the personal data of teenagers, so for clarity, over 13-year-olds, to make recommendations to them. So it's all about kind of the recommender systems that they use. It also announced that it opened investigations into Imgur and Reddit in respect of how they process the personal data of children for age assurance purposes. These developments broadly align with the trends we are seeing in the online safety space in the EU and the UK. In the EU, we're seeing a lot of investigations based on Article 28 of the DSA and how platforms are designed in a way that ensure a high standard of privacy and safety for minors. In the UK, Faye's going to talk a little bit more about the Online Safety Act later, but as enforcement ramps up under the Online Safety Act, particularly in respect of child safety obligations, we're likely to see the ICO and Ofcom working closely together to ensure that their efforts are coordinated. Finally, I want to touch on the ICO's key strategic objectives, and we've grouped these into two main goals. The first of these is empowerment through information. So the ICO has made it clear that it's provided us with a wealth of very practical and user-friendly guidance. And the objective here is to ensure that data subjects feel empowered to choose vendors and suppliers and services that ultimately they have trust in from a data privacy standpoint. This also means that they're able to more effectively and appropriately exercise their data subject rights. And as an ultimate consequence of this, there are fewer complaints to the ICO. So very much a root cause solution, which is always something that we really like to see. The second key goal is empowering responsible innovation and sustainable economic growth. Again, the ICO has emphasized that it intends to not only provide businesses with very helpful guidance, but also provide early and assured advice to them during product development stage to ensure that they have the regulatory certainty that they need to seek investments and to ultimately launch their products. I think these objectives very much reflect the ICO's long-standing reputation for pragmatism, and they're certainly aligned with the UK government's current pro-growth agenda, which Simon is going to talk about in a little more detail. But in a nutshell, Keir Starmer has made no secret of his intention to make the UK a world leader in AI and robotics. Whether he'll be successful, we have to wait and see, but he's definitely doing a better job than his predecessors, one of whom failed to speak convincingly about robotics, and another of whom maybe went a little bit too far and was himself accused of actually being a robot. So to summarize, and contrary to what some may lead you to believe, the ICO is not invisible. It just chooses to regulate in a way that promotes and encourages compliance rather than penalizing non-compliance. So it's very much a case of how to rather than don't do. I'm going to pass you over to Simon now.